Hello and welcome to Tech Deals Part 2 of the $4,000 Ultimate System Build 2017 edition with the Skylake-X i7-7820X CPU. This video is the Y vlog, or rather part 1 of the Y vlog. It's so long I've split it into 2 videos. This is exclusively going to be the discussion of the processor choice. In this video, I'm going to discuss the relative pros and cons of Skylake-X versus Ryzen 7 versus Threadripper versus the upcoming Intel Coffee Lake, which is the i7-8700K, 6 cores, 12 threads, should you wait for it. Now this build is on the high-end desktop platform from Intel, and it really is distinct from the consumer platforms. But I've seen so many people say, why would anybody build a Skylake-X when Coffee Lake is coming? I thought it was worth addressing. If you came to this video looking for discussions on RAM, storage, power supplies, graphics cards, and cases, that will be part 3 of this video series. Linked down in the video description below, the very first link will be the full playlist for all the videos in this series. Coming up after that, part 4 is going to be the build video. That's where I put the camera overhead and step-by-step go through the build process of this system. And then after that is going to be system setup, BIOS updating, installing Windows, installing drivers, etc. Then Windows performance, game performance, and then finally a final review and evaluation. So be sure you're subscribed to my channel to see updates when those videos come out. Please also consider looking at the rest of the video description down below. Links to all of the CPUs that I'm discussing in today's video will be down there. Well, not Coffee Lake because it's not out yet, but I may add that when it does launch. We don't know when it's coming yet. But links to everything else, as well as everything in the build, will be down in the description below. Maybe Skylake-X is right for you. Maybe Threadripper's right for you. That's fine. They'll all be down there. Finally, at the very bottom of the video description are links to my Twitter, Twitch, and Patreon accounts. Please consider visiting me, following me, and supporting me if you are able to do so. First up, let's get some housekeeping notes out of the way. Now, I will talk about the i7 in this video. I will also talk about the i9-7900X. You'll notice that it's not here. I don't have one, unfortunately. Intel sent me this, not the 10-core chip. You will also see me talk about Threadripper quite a bit. Notice this is not a real Threadripper. Unfortunately, AMD did not send me one, and I simply don't have the money to buy one, so this kind of is a substitute. But I do have all the Ryzen 7 CPUs, and I will talk about that. And of course, the Coffee Lake is not released yet, so the KB Lake chip is sort of a stand-in to give me something to reference and talk about. This is the older AMD FX 8300 8-core CPU from the prior generation before Ryzen. No, none of you should go buy this now, but it's here because I'm going to talk about the differences between performance and core count later in this video. First up, what is the high-end desktop platform in the first place? Why should you care, and is this for you? The Intel current high-end desktop platform is the X299 series, and the AMD Threadripper runs on X399. See what they did there? The reality is most people don't need these, but if you do, they are both worth considering. They each have their strengths and weaknesses. Now, they both have a variety of processors with core counts, frequencies, etc. available. All of the AMD Threadripper processors have 64 PCI Express Lanes total, 60 directly from the CPU and 4 through the chipset. Some of Intel Skylake-X chips have 28 PCI Express Lanes through the CPU and 4 more through the chipset for a total of 32. And then some have 44 plus 4 through the chipset for a total of 48. Whether or not you need all those lanes is a separate conversation. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Both platforms support quad channel memory up to 128 gigabytes of RAM, up to 8 memory modules. Both support SLI and Crossfire, and both have a variety of motherboards with a lot of different features. Prices generally range from about the $250 price point up above $500, depending upon how much you want. This particular motherboard here is $400, but MSI makes X299 boards that are much closer to the $200 price point, but they are missing some features. There are fewer current Threadripper motherboards available on the market, but I do expect to see in the coming months more options available from the various companies. So there are many things to choose from on both sides. But the high-end desktop platform essentially has more cores, more threads, more PCI Express lanes, quad channel RAM support, the ability to plug in more devices, have more expansion capability, and generally they're designed for workstation or high-end enthusiast level users. Most people need neither one of these. If your primary interest is in gaming and general web use, even light streaming onto services such as Twitch, Either a Ryzen 7, a current i7, or the upcoming i7 8700K Coffee Lake processor will far better serve your needs at a more reasonable price than either Skylake-X or Threadripper, neither of which have gaming as their primary focus. And yes, I understand gaming is prominently displayed on this motherboard here. Gaming is kind of like RGB. It sells boards, it sells systems, and so they put gaming on everything these days. The reality is this is a great board for non-gaming tasks, but Redbox Gaming sells boards. Now, if you have decided to bypass the consumer level processors and step up to the high-end desktop platforms, your next question is, which do you buy? And to answer that, you have to first answer, why did you decide to bypass these? What are you buying the computer for? What are you building the machine for? What is the primary goal? Some tasks run better on Threadripper, some run better on Skylake-X. It just depends upon what you're buying a system for. Now for this next bit of discussion, let me be clear. I'm talking about the i9 7900X, which is $1,000, versus the Threadripper 1950X, which is 16 cores, 32 threads for $1,000. And I realize that this is the 8-core chip here, but let me talk about the $2,000 processors for a minute. That removes price from the equation. The motherboards are a similar price, the CPUs are now the same price, so now it simply comes down to which is the better platform. If your primary goal is to render H.264 video in Handbrake, Threadripper is 15 to 20% faster than the i9 7900X. However, staying in Handbrake, H.265, the high efficiency video codec, is faster on Skylake-X. Yes, you heard that right. 10 cores, 20 threads on the i9 7900X beats the 16 cores, 32 threads on the Threadripper 1950X by 5 to 10% in HVEC encoding. Every other program you're going to see flip-flops back and forth between the two processors. Intel has the advantage of more advanced AVX instructions. They have the advantage of higher per clock per core efficiency than Threadripper does, and they have the advantage of higher clock speeds. But there's fewer cores. Some programs benefit more from the higher clock speed and the advanced instructions. Some programs benefit more from the additional cores of Threadripper. It is not as clear-cut as saying more cores is better than less cores. It depends upon what you're doing with the machine. Speaking of cores, let's talk about those for a minute. How many of you know what this is? That is an AMD FX 8300. No, none of you should go buy one at this point, but that is the prior generation of processors that was out before Ryzen came out. Now this has 8 cores, it says so right on the top of the box. Well, it had 8 integer units and 4 floating point units and some shared circuitry, but it's mostly an 8-core processor. This i7 7700K is a 4-core processor with hyperthreading. How many of you would be willing to trade me your 7700K and in return I'll give you an FX 8300? That would be crazy, would it not? Because everybody agrees that an i7 7700K is faster than this because its instructions per clock cycle, its per core performance is superior to the FX 8300. That's why you can buy an FX 8300 for $100, and this is a $300+ CPU. Now, having said that, there are times and places where the FX 8300 is remarkably competitive with the 7700K. And I'm not just talking about synthetic tests such as Cinebench. Are you doing things like file compression? Are you doing 3D animation? Are you doing video encoding such as H.264? No, an FX 8300 isn't quite as fast as this chip, but it's really close and it's a whole lot less expensive. So from a value equation, if you're not gaming, if you're doing that kind of work, the FX 8300 is actually not bad. Now, the Ryzen 7 completely obliterates it in terms of performance. And if you're doing that kind of work, it's absolutely worth upgrading from an FX series processor to Ryzen 7, at the very least, if you're doing 3D animation, video encoding, that sort of thing. But it is amazingly competitive with 4-core processors just due to the fact that it has those extra integer units, which the i7 7700K does not have. Now, let me be clear. The disparity in per-core performance between Skylake-X and Threadripper is not as much as it is between the 7700K and the FX 8300. AMD has made tremendous strides in performance, and the Ryzen core, the Zen core, is such improved over the FX line. It really does make a big and dramatic difference. That being said, On a per core, per clock basis, Skylake-X is still faster overall than each individual core on the Threadripper and the Ryzen 7 chips. It also has the benefit of a higher clock speed. This particular chip turbo boosts to 4.5 gigahertz out of the box. Now, it does not do that on all 8 cores, but of course it's overclockable, and you can overclock it to about 4.5 fixed on all the cores. Now, Threadripper is overclockable as well, but few people get more than 4 gigahertz on all the cores out of it, and many people don't even get that. 16 cores gets very, very hot and requires a tremendous amount of cooling. Speaking of cooling, that is another important topic to talk about: cooling, temperature, power draw, and TDP. Skylake-X up to the i9-7900X is a 140 watt TDP processor. Threadripper is a 180 watt TDP processor. However, TDP is not necessarily how much power they need, and if you overclock the chips, you will go way over those numbers, and basically you need all the cooling, and that applies for both platforms. It is worth noting that the higher core counts coming in about 30 days from when I filmed this video, give or take up to 18 cores, are going to be up to 165 watt TDP on the Skylake-X side. Now, as far as cooling goes, this is an important point. Skylake-X maintains compatibility with all the existing coolers that use the 2011 pinout format, so you don't need new coolers, mounters, adapters, or anything else. All the existing high-end coolers on the market that will plug into the older X99 boards plug into the X299 with no conversion or no adjustments necessary. The same cannot be said, however, of Threadripper, which really needs all new coolers. Now, it is true that Threadripper ships with an adapter in the box to let you use all the popular models of closed-loop liquid coolers on the market, and companies such as EK are starting to come out with customized water blocks actually for Threadripper. I would highly advise you to get one of those. I've been watching the videos over at Jay's 2 Cents and Gamers Nexus where they've been testing some of these newer water blocks that actually fit it, and I also watched the cooling testing that Gamers Nexus did on the adapter, and frankly, I would skip the adapter at this point. If you didn't get one at launch, wait on Threadripper at least until you can get a liquid cooler or an extremely high-end air cooler such as the Noctua cooler, which comes specifically designed for the shape of the Threadripper chip. Now, if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, Threadripper is a rectangle-shaped chip, whereas all the others are square, and the existing coolers only cover about half of the actual CPU die, and the cooling performance, frankly, is pretty dreadful. It should get dramatically better once we get coolers that are specifically designed for it. It will not take years. We're looking at months. By the end of 2017, all the major cooler companies should have Threadripper specific coolers out. But this does mean that if you already own a cooler, you really will need to replace it. Now, this brings up another very important point regarding overclocking. Now, these are both unlocked processors, and yes, absolutely you can overclock them. But as I said in part 1 of this video, the kind of person who's going to buy this machine is somebody who makes money with their computer. You're okay to spend this much money because it's going to make you more than that in your work. Otherwise, you're probably better off on the consumer platforms unless you just have lots of money and you just want the best. But if you're making money with your computer, absolute stability is often more important than an extra 5 or 10% performance. Sure, you can overclock both of these processors mildly, but if you overclock them very much, the temperature and power consumption on both of them goes up very quickly, and you may run into stability issues. How many crashes and how many hours of lost work are required before any extra performance you get is simply not worth the money. I think that the average professional who uses these on a day-to-day basis to make money with should give serious consideration to running them at their stock clock speeds and not overclocking them. Now, not to worry, I will do overclocking testing when I actually do the builds, certainly with this, and hopefully I can get AMD to send me a Threadripper, and I will do the same as well because people are curious, and of course, some people may choose to do so. But my advice is if you make money with your computer, run it at stock clock speeds, get absolute 100% stability. It's not worth having a machine crash just to get an extra 5 or 10% performance. Speaking of performance, you can't talk about these CPUs without talking about an upgrade path. Now, the Threadripper with 16 cores and 32 threads is a great CPU, and it is in fact a great value for the money. At $1,000, it certainly gives you a lot of performance, a lot of capability. But there's nothing higher than that to buy. It is the top-end processor. If you spend that same $1,000 on an i9-7900X, you still have a bunch more processors coming out very shortly above that. If you spend the $1,000 on that today, even if it's maybe 5 to 10% slower in many tasks than a Threadripper, You always have the option to upgrade to, for example, the 18-core 36-thread processor that is coming out at the end of September. Now, it's not an inexpensive processor, but if you make money with your computer and you have a need of that many cores, that many threads, and that much performance, you may very well find that that makes a lot of sense. And it absolutely will crush the Threadripper in terms of total performance, because this is already holding its own with the $1,000 Threadripper today. If you give Skylake-X 18 cores and 32 threads, it will be faster. How much faster, we'll have to wait and see, but they have announced that the top turbo speed out of the box on the 18-core chip is going to be 4.4 gigahertz. Now, it won't run on that on all the cores to be sure, but it should still provide superior performance in most applications that are heavily threaded. Now, I don't want to belabor the point, but I do want to repeat this point because inevitably I'm going to get comments from people who say, but that's crazy. You're talking about the difference between a $2,000 processor and a $1,000 processor. Of course the $2,000 processor is faster. That's true, but the $2,000 processor is an option. It isn't on Threadripper. Now, if AMD came out tomorrow and said, oh, we're going to bring a 32-core, 64-thread EPYC processor to the TR4 platform, and it'll be available for $2,000, that changes this. But there is no information, not even any rumors, that that may happen. Now, again, for all the people who think that $2,000 is crazy to spend on a processor, it is for the average person. Most people's whole computers don't cost that much. But to professionals who actually will use that performance, who make money with their computer, all you have to do is make more than $1,000 extra on your computer over its entire lifetime to justify the extra $1,000 upgrading from the 10-core to the 18-core processor. For somebody who actually does animation, video rendering, and other tasks where time is money, that's a very small amount of money to get an incredible amount of performance on a desktop platform. Moving on to PCI Express Lanes. Threadripper comes with 64 total. Skylake-X, at least on the i9 side, comes with 48 total. Threadripper has 60 directly from the CPU to the graphics cards, NVMe drives, etc., and 4 more to the chipset for a total of 64. Skylake-X, at least at the i9 level and up, has 44 PCI Express lanes to the graphics cards, NVMe drives, etc., and then 4 more to the chipset itself for things like USB ports and SATA drives, etc. It is worth noting that the i7 Skylake-X's have 28 PCI Express lanes, 28 to the rest of the system and then 4 more to the chipset. Now, 28 is actually enough for most people. In my own use case, 16 of those will be going to the one graphics card I have installed, and then 12 of them will be going to my 3 NVMe solid-state drives. 12 plus 16 is 28, so there are plenty of PCI Express lanes for my needs. Now, if I wanted to install a second graphics card and I wanted them to both run at 16x on the bus, then it would not be enough, to be sure. Now, the 4 PCI Express lanes that run to the chipset is enough for everything else. That handles the SATA hard drives and SSDs, it handles the USB ports and other things. Most of those are connected to the chipset regardless of what CPU you install. In general, even if you get one of the 44 bus, if you get the i9 7900X, you're still only working with 4 PCI Express lanes to the chipset. Your SATA hard drives and SSDs, your USB ports are still running through the chipset. That's true on Threadripper, by the way, as well. While it does in fact have 60 PCI Express lanes coming out of the CPU, which is incredible, that's awesome, there's still only 4 going to the chipset. So your USB ports and your SATA devices are still sharing that 4x connection. So from that respect, they're the same, but there is room for more graphics cards and more NVMe drives on Threadripper than there is on even the high-end Skylake-X. The question is, do you actually have enough direct connect PCI Express devices to actually use all that connection? Well, that's a personal choice. You might. There will be people who absolutely choose Threadripper because of its higher lanes. But even me, so long as I'm keeping to one graphics card, and I have no interest in SLI, then 3 NVMe and 1 PCI Express graphics card, 28 lanes, it's all that you need. Fast RAM support is something that might be of interest to you. The nice thing about the Skylake-X side of things is because Intel has been doing DDR4 RAM for a while and they've been doing fast RAM for a while, you can pretty much buy any DDR4 3200 MHz kit and it's going to work in this just fine. You can buy most DDR4 3600 and even 4000 kits and they'll work in Skylake-X just fine. Now, Ryzen does have reasonably good support for DDR4 3200 and AMD claims up to DDR4 3600 on Threadripper, but that's going to be very RAM specific. My experience with trying to install high-speed RAM, even 3200, even using the latest BIOSes on the Ryzen platform, is extremely hit and miss. I have yet to find a single DDR4 3200 MHz RAM kit that works in all of my Ryzen boards. Some kits run at 3200 in some boards, some run in others, but none run in all, and oftentimes a kit that runs over here doesn't here, and one runs here and not vice versa. It's very annoying. Now, as far as Threadripper goes, because I've not actually tested the X399 platform, I can't speak to my personal experiences, but my understanding is that finding RAM kits that run at least in quad channel RAM at 32 or 3600 is just as challenging over there as it is on the Ryzen platform. I say all this because if you have a task that actually depends upon high-speed memory, if you're running a lot of virtual machines, if you're doing large-scale database development or you're doing software development, if you are doing a lot of file moving around, file compression, decompression, you will find that faster RAM makes a bigger difference for those type of applications. I've covered RAM in the past. I recently did some RAM speed testing demonstrating that for the average consumer, 2666 versus 3200 is a trivial difference. I did that on the Ryzen platform, and it's true for the consumer. For the kind of person buying these kind of machines, faster RAM starts to make a larger difference. In just a minute, I'm going to talk a bit more about my personal situation, what I would spend my own money on, and how my own workload with working with YouTube videos and Adobe Premiere Pro is affected based upon these processors. But there's one more chip I have not yet talked about that I would like to bring up at this point. In a few days, AMD is going to be launching the Ryzen Threadripper 1900X. It is an 8-core, 16-thread CPU. Sound familiar? It's the same core count and thread count as the consumer Ryzen platform. In fact, the Ryzen 7 1800X is almost identically clocked in terms of speed. What you are getting with the 1900X is you're getting the 64 PCI Express Lanes, quad-channel RAM, and the higher-end platform of the X399 versus the X370 platform. Threadripper 1900X has a list price of $549, placing it $50 less than Skylake-X 8-core, $50 more than 1800X. When you take the motherboard cost differences into account, you're looking at a real-world price difference of between $200 to $300 more from 1800X to 1900X, which seems expensive to a consumer. But it's not if you need the PCI Express lanes and you need the quad channel RAM, but don't necessarily need 16 cores. Not all workloads scale to 16 cores, but they do benefit from the PCI Express lanes. They do benefit from the faster RAM. It also provides you the upgrade option to go to 1950X if you want to. Although that's such a relatively small price difference, all things considered, if you are in need of that kind of work, I would suggest just getting the 1950X to begin with. What will change that in the future is if they do announce, say, a 32-core processor at the $2,000 price point. If they do come out with that, maybe you start with the $500 chip, you use it for 6 months to a year, make some money, and then you buy the 32-core processor if they ever come out with one. That, by the way, circling back around, is why this actually makes sense. Even though a lot of people will say it doesn't, it really does. If you want to get onto the X299 platform, but you don't have a ton of money, maybe you're like, I want the best. I really want that 18-core, 36-thread processor, but I just don't have $2,000 right now. But I will in 6 months. I'll make some money with this, and then I'll be able to afford it. $600 for the i7 7820 gets you into the X299 platform. It gets you 28 PCI Express lanes, quad channel RAM. It gets you a professional environment that can be upgraded to the 18-core processor in the future when you've got more money. Now, while it's true that you got to pull this out and put that in, if you can afford a $2,000 processor in 6 months to a year time, that's a minor thing. If you're making money with your computer, you'll be able to justify that. Going from 550 on the 1900X to 1000 on the 1950 is a much harder argument to make. The gap is not that far apart, all things considered. So I like the upgrade option here, and I would encourage AMD to do the same thing on the Threadripper side, to put a 32-core $2,000 chip in, because then I think that 1900X will make a lot of sense for many people. Now I want to spend a few minutes talking about my personal situation making videos for YouTube. It's the most relatable for me, at least, because I actually do this on a regular basis. As I said in part 1 of this video series, I currently do my editing on a Ryzen 7 1700 CPU, which was an upgrade from my former 6-core 12-thread Broadwell-E i7-7800X. The reality is, for 4K 60 frame per second video editing in Adobe Premiere Pro, going from 6 cores to 8 cores did make a difference. I was actually surprised at how much smoother my video editing experience was. But the reality is, it's now smooth. It can't get much smoother than smooth. When I hit play, when I scrub through the timeline, it's very responsive, more so than on the 6-core chip. That was a very nice, pleasant surprise, even though my 1700 runs at a slower clock speed. There is, however, a limit to the scaling of core usage in Adobe Creative Cloud. It is well known online that Adobe is not the most optimized software out there. Some other programs do a better job of it. I mentioned Handbrake before in H.264 and H.265 encoding. The reality, Handbrake does a better job of multi-threading and encoding than Adobe Premiere Pro does. Adobe Premiere Pro likes fast cores. It does like lots of cores, but only to a point. Adobe Premiere Pro will not make as effective use of the 16 cores here as it would of the 10 cores on the Skylake-X, and it really loves fast cores, and it really loves Intel CPUs. While my timeline scrubbing and editing performance is better on Ryzen 7, the actual rendering time is not really any better. When I render videos on my 3.8 GHz 8-core 16-thread Ryzen 7 1700, the actual render time, how many minutes it takes to render each minute of video once I'm finished editing, is almost exactly the same as my 4.2 GHz Broadwell-E i7 8700K with 6 cores. Yes, it has more cores, but the clock speed's a bit slower, and the per-core render speed in Adobe Premiere Pro is not quite as good. But I am not wanting a faster CPU for better rendering performance. I'm wanting it for faster editing and faster multitasking performance. I want to be able to do more with my machine than just that. And this brings me back to the beginning of this video when I said which one you choose and if you should choose one at all. It depends entirely upon what you're doing. And this leads me to what would I buy with my own money. Those of you who have been following me for the past 6 months since Ryzen 7's launch will know I am a big fan of Ryzen 5, Ryzen 7, Ryzen 3 to a lesser extent, just because I think that Ryzen 5 is a better long-term play for most people. But even that being said, I love it. It brought competition back to the marketplace. It gave Intel a run for its money. The Ryzen 7 1700, I think, for the average person is a better buy than the i7 7700K. 8 cores, 16 threads at only a slight per core deficiency to the i7. Double the cores, double the threads, overclocks and less expensive motherboards. Comes with a great cooler, this does not. I think for the average person, it's a better buy. There are still people who should buy a 7700K, but it's a small percentage of people. Most people are actually better off with a Ryzen 5 1600, believe it or not. Just as a side note, because that information will age quickly because Coffee Lake is coming. And the i7 on Coffee Lake is going to be 6 cores, 12 threads, turboing up to 4.7 out of the box. That's going to be interesting. It's all going to depend upon price. We don't know what price that'll come at. My advice on Ryzen versus Intel may change, or it may not, depending upon what price that launches at. I promise one way or another I'll have coverage for Coffee Lake. Hopefully I can get Intel to send me chips and I'll have launch day reviews, but we'll just have to see how that goes. In any case, right now for budget-conscious buyers, Ryzen 7 or Ryzen 5 are absolutely awesome. For performance buyers, i7 7700K is where it's at. Now I have to preface that to explain what I'm about to tell you here. If I was spending $1,000 of my own money and I had to choose between i9 7900X and Threadripper 1950X, I would spend my own money on the Intel Skylake-X i9 7900X. Now, those of you who have been watching me for 6 months, don't all fall down at once, because I have heaped endless praise on the Ryzen processors. but that praise largely comes about due to their value. When it comes to just using a machine on a day-to-day basis, Intel's faster. This costs less. And for a consumer, for somebody who's just looking for a machine that gives lots of performance for a very reasonable price, Ryzen wins. For absolute performance, Intel wins, even with the lower core count in my workload. And that's a very important point. In Adobe Premiere Pro, with the way I use a computer, a 10-core, 20-thread i9-7900X will be faster for me on a day-to-day basis than a 16-core, 32-thread Threadripper 1950X. Now, if AMD sent me one, I wouldn't turn it down, and I would certainly find good use for it. Perhaps I would do my video editing and day-to-day use on the Skylake, and then I would just off-put my renders to the Threadripper because they'd be just fine. But if I had to spend $1,000 and I could only pick one for day-to-day use, I would pick the Intel. It is absolutely worth noting that this is not just a video editing and video render machine for me. This is my personal machine that will do everything: playing games, browsing the web, multitasking, as well as editing and rendering videos. An i7 or an i9 from Intel is in fact faster in those tasks. The reason why I do everything on my Ryzen 7 is because I find 4 cores and 8 threads to be very limiting in 2017. And after having gone to 8 cores, I would absolutely not want to go back to 4 at this point. It does the job, but I find it to be quite limiting. Even my Broadwell E with only 6 cores, I find to be quite limiting. This processor, the i7-7820X, basically gives me the best of both worlds. It gives me Intel's higher per core performance, it gives me higher clock speed, and it gives me the 8-core 16 threads that I currently get on Ryzen. Now, it absolutely costs more money, but as noted in the first video, I have a benefit here. Intel was kind enough to send me this CPU, MSI was kind enough to send me that motherboard, so I didn't have to buy them. That is a very nice thing. If Intel had not sent me this, and AMD had sent me Threadripper, would I use Threadripper as my day-to-day machine? Yes, I would. So in that respect, whichever company was willing to send me one certainly was going to get that spot. However, I will not turn down a Threadripper, and I will give it a fair and honest review if AMD chooses to send me one, and I will absolutely put it to good use in terms of day-to-day video editing. In fact, I might actually split my machines at that point. If they were willing to send me one of those, I may off-put my video editing work onto that and use the Skylake-X for my day-to-day work. Even for playing games and day-to-day non-video rendering work, I still would rather have 8 cores over 4 or 6 at this point. Once you've gotten used to 8 cores, it really does make a difference. I've said this before regarding the Ryzen 7, and I see a lot of people say, well, you don't need a Ryzen 7 for just day-to-day use. The Ryzen 5 is fine. And it is, if you've never used a Ryzen 7. But once you've used one, you wouldn't want to go back. It really does change how you use a computer. One more thing I want to talk about, yes, there's been a lot of those in this video. One more thing I want to talk about is it worth the $400 price increase to go from the i7-7820X to the i9-7900X? It's $400 for 2 more cores, 4 more threads, and some more PCI Express lanes. Now, for my personal use, I don't think the PCI Express lanes make any difference to me. The graphics card, my 3 NVMe drives, are totally covered by the 28 lanes off the CPU, and as I said before, everything else goes through the chipset anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But it's nice to have for the future. You never know what you might add. However, the really interesting question is, do the extra cores make a difference? Yes and no. Do they make $400 worth of difference? Do they make the difference for me? Probably not. However, it's worth noting that I don't have a 7900X, so I can't test it. Hopefully I can get Intel to send me one. I will test the two and compare them if they will. I didn't expect 8 cores on the Ryzen 7 to make a difference. Going from Broadwell E to Ryzen 7 made a bigger difference in my day-to-day use of a computer than I thought it would. I was genuinely surprised. So I might be surprised again. Going to 10 cores might equally surprise me. It is worth noting that there are other differences on the 10-core chip besides just the cores and the PCI Express lanes. Some of the extra instruction modules, the AVX modules, have enhancements in the i9s that are not present in the i7s. I don't want to get into the technical details here. I'd have to reference a sheet to explain it anyway because there's minute differences. But if you are on a high-end platform and you're doing advanced instructions, the i9 actually has some things in it, duplicated instruction units in the AVX that the i7s don't have, and that might make a difference depending upon the kind of workload that you're doing. Looking at all of the information based upon what I know right now, not having a 7900X, would I personally spend the $400? Yes, I would. I make 4K YouTube videos for a living. I was genuinely surprised at the difference going from 6 to 8 cores. I am willing to bet that I would be surprised again. At least I'm willing to spend the $400, and the reason is I use my computer all day long for heavy multitasking. I am often doing multiple things at once. I'm editing a video while rendering a video, while watching another video to keep myself amused while I'm editing an hour-long video. So if I were spending my own money, I would get a 7900X. Why is there not a 7900X here? Intel didn't give me the choice. They sent me this, and I'm grateful. But if they send me a 7900X, I'll absolutely swap it out. Would my use case justify the 18-core $2,000 chip? I have absolutely no idea. It isn't out. There's no benchmarks. I can't talk to anybody about it. So I don't know. We'll leave that for another time. Now, what about Threadripper? Now, the 1900X for $549 is launching in a few days. What about the mid-level chip, the 1920X with 12 cores, 24 threads for $800? In my opinion, don't bother. If you're going to spend $800 on a CPU and $300 to $400 on a motherboard, spend the extra $200 and get the 16-core chip. They're just trying to meet each of the price points, and they probably have some harvested chips to put in there, so it's either make them that or not sell them at all. But in my opinion, 800 versus 1,000, 20% difference, 4 cores, 8 threads, just get the 16-core chip. Now, if you can find at some point in the future the 12-core chip for less than that, if there were a $350 price difference between the 16 and 12-core chip, then the 12-core chip might be more interesting. They have the same number of PCI Express lanes, almost everything else is identical, it's just the core count. But at $200, which is the current price difference, don't bother, just get the 16-core chip. If you take nothing else away from this video, there is one point that I want everybody watching this video to keep in mind. You have choices. A year ago when Broadwell E was out and I did my i7 6800K video, you didn't. There wasn't anything to compete with it. The i9 7900X is a 10-core 20-thread processor for $1,000, but the 10-core 20-thread Broadwell E last year was $1,750. Because of Ryzen, because of Threadripper, Intel cut $750 off the price of that chip. Competition benefits all of us. Whether you buy a Skylake-X, whether you buy a Threadripper, we are all better off with these choices. At the end of the day, putting everything I've set aside, if you need one of these chips, it almost doesn't matter which one you buy, because the reality is plus or minus 10 or 15%, they're very close in terms of performance. Well, the $1,000 chips, not this one. They're very close in terms of performance. They're both amazing improvements for high-end users over the consumer level chips. And frankly, unless you put them side by side, what you will experience is a great machine that's really powerful and does an incredible amount of work for less money than you've ever been able to get that performance for before. Choices, they're good things. This has been part 2 of the $4,000 Ultimate System Build 2017 edition with Skylake-X. Coming up next will be the rest of the computer. Same basic concept, but I'll cover all of the parts, maybe in a bit less detail, but there was so much to discuss here that I gave it its own video. Be sure to check out the link down in the video description below to the full playlist of everything here. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with that big huge red button. That's how you get notifications of future videos. Be sure to check out the video description down below to links to Amazon and Newegg for all of these processors, as well as to everything that's actually in the system build. And be sure to leave your comments down below. Be sure to follow me on Twitch, Twitter, and support me on Patreon if you're able. Those are also down in the video description. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.